Mollusks and annelids are the most well-known of the Lophotrochozoans, and they both have trochophore larvae. Phylum Mollusca includes clams, oysters, squid, octopi, snails, slugs, and chitons, as well as many more animals. In fact, this is the second largest animal phylum with over 100,000 species, making up to 25% of all marine species. Phylum Annelida are the segmented worms that include earthworms, tube worms, clam worms, and leeches. Both groups are bilaterally symmetrical, cephalized, triploblastic, schizocoelous eucoelomates.
And once again,
are bilaterally symmetrical, cephalized, triploblastic, schizocoelous eucoelomates.
You sure you got all that? Mollusca means soft-bodied, but most mollusks have a hardened calcium carbonate shell that protects the soft body. Found mostly in marine environments, they can also be found on land and in freshwater habitats, such is the case for many slugs, snails, and mussels found in Kentucky. All mollusks share the following features: a muscular foot for locomotion. Most internal organs are housed in a large region called the visceral mass, and a mantle, which can produce a calcium carbonate shell, except in slugs, and it is much greatly reduced in octopi. Except for bivalves like clams and oysters, all mollusks have a radula, which is an abrasive tongue-like structure used to scrape food off of surfaces. This radula can be modified in some groups. The foot in most mollusks is retractable and extendable, but in squid and octopi it is modified as a funnel for jet propulsion and made into arms and tentacles. The visceral mass houses all the organs, but the respiratory organs vary depending on whether the organism is aquatic or terrestrial. If aquatic, the gills extend into the mantle cavity, and if terrestrial, rudimentary lungs develop around the lining of the mantle. The coelom exists, but it is reduced to around the heart only, and sometimes excretory and reproductive structures. Most mollusks are dioecious with external reproduction, except for terrestrial snails and slugs and cephalopods. There are 8 classes of mollusks, but I will only focus on 4 of them. First is Polyplacophora, also known as the chitons. All chitons have an 8-plate ventral shell that can allow the organism to fold into a ball slightly. The ventral foot allows the animal to stay sucked onto rocks where it feeds on algae using its radula. In fact, the teeth of a chiton's radula is harder than the enamel of our teeth. The nervous system is rudimentary, with ganglia at the interior end and photosensors embedded in the shell. Respiration occurs by gills on either side of the foot. Class Bivalvia includes clams, oysters, mussels, scallops, geoducks, and shipworms, named for the soft-bodied organism being enclosed by 2 shells. A hinge allows the shells to open, and teeth on the opposite end keep the shells aligned. Adductor and abductor muscles close and open the shell. These also make up a delicious scallops that I like to eat. Bivalves are filter feeders with no radula. Water with food particles are brought in by the incurrent siphon, and waste and water leave by the excurrent siphon. Food gets trapped in the gills, which filters food from water and food and gets sent to the mouth. Gills also help with gas exchange. The muscular foot appears like a tongue to our human eyes and is actually used to move the bivalve around the surface or burrow into the substrate. Some bivalves have eye spots along the mantle which can detect light. 3 pairs of ganglia regulate nervous functions of all bivalves. More than half of all mollusks are in class Gastropoda, which includes the snails, slugs, conchs, limpets, whelks, and cowries. This group has members that live on land, freshwater, and marine habitats. Gastropods all have torsion, which occurs during embryological development where the mantle and visceral mass are rotated. This causes the anal opening of the digestive tract to be right behind the head. Torsion also causes the organs to flip sides. Torsion frees up space to allow for the sensitive head to curl up into the shell, leaving the tougher foot to guard the opening. Sometimes an operculum or hardened protective covering completely encloses the gastropod. The muscular foot is used for crawling on surfaces, and many have well-defined head and eyes. They feed using a radula to scrape algae and debris off of surfaces. Respiration occurs in the gills, which are enclosed by the mantle, but terrestrial gastropods use the mantle cavity as a sort of lung. Next group is class Cephalopoda. This group contains some of the most intelligent invertebrates on the planet. They also exhibit a loss in shell as you go from the most ancestral to derived species. The nautilus is the most ancestral of cephalopods, having a complete multi-chambered cell. These are filled with gases and water to maintain buoyancy. Squids and cuttlefish have a reduced internal shell. Cuttlefish have a cuttle bone, which is sold in pet stores for birds as a source of calcium carbonate. Squids have a reduced shell called a pin, and octopi altogether have no shell. Cephalopods have the ability to rapidly change color because of chromatophores, which expand and contract to produce different colors. All cephalopods are carnivores with beak-like jaws in addition to the radula. They have a well-developed nervous system, making them one of the most intelligent invertebrates. They also have fully developed eyes, which can form images similar to ours. Cephalopods have a closed circulatory system with blood completely enclosed in vessels. In cephalopods, the foot is lobed and divided into arms and tentacles with suckers on some to help with sticking to surfaces. Locomotion is done by jet propulsion of water out of a siphon. Gills are attached to the wall of a mantle and gases diffuse into nearby blood vessels, each with their own heart. Squid and octopi produce ink, which is used to hide from predators. Cephalopods are dioecious with elaborate mating rituals. Instead of producing trochophore larvae, females produce eggs and care for them for an extended period, often with the mother dying afterwards. Once the eggs are hatched, the juveniles look like miniature versions of the adults. Mating is mostly internal, where a male produces a packet of sperm made by one of his arms and places into the female's mantle cavity. Our next phylum consists of the true segmented worms phylum Annelida. The key feature of this group is metamerism, or true segmentation, meaning repeated body parts. This is found in annelids, arthropods, and vertebrates. In fact, our vertebrae is an example of metamerism. Over 16,000 species have been described, which includes the marine worms, earthworms, and leeches. These animals are found in marine freshwater and damp soils. Annelids have bilateral symmetry with repeated ring-like segments. These segments have repeated structures both inside and outside of the worm. Metamerism provides the advantage of compartmentalizing body systems, but also making movement more efficient. In earthworms and leeches, they have a specialized segment region called a clitellum, which is a reproductive structure that allows for sperm transfer between two worms, because earthworms are monoecious, having both sexes on the same animal. Therefore, the clitellum eventually becomes a cocoon to help make baby worms. The cuticle is a general term for the outermost layer, and in Lophotrochozoans, it does not shed while it grows, but it actually grows with the organism. Unfortunately, the cuticle is thinner and more prone to injury. Most annelids have setae, which are bristle tips that help anchor the worm to the ground. In polychaetes, they have additional parapodia known as appendages with the setae on the edge of the parapodia. Annelids have complex and well-developed digestive systems. Tube worms are filter feeders using their parapodia for collecting debris. Clam worms have jaws or tentacles or a proboscis to capture prey. Earthworms simply eat their way through the substrate. And finally, leeches have suckers and teeth to help collect blood. The digestive tract includes a mouth, pharynx, crop, which is an organ that stores food, and a gizzard, an organ that grinds food, intestines, which help absorb food, and finally, an anal opening to help get rid of waste. Most annelids have a closed circulatory system where blood remains in blood vessels. Two main vessels are the ventral and dorsal blood vessels, with transverse loops that allow exchange in between. There are several aorta, but commonly these are called hearts. Gas exchange is done by diffusion through the skin, and this explains the slimy texture of their skin because gas exchange requires moisture. Unfortunately, this also limits them to aquatic to moist habitats. Excretion is done by a set of nephridia found in each segment. This collects nitrogenous waste, and the worm releases the waste through skin. The nervous system is a series of fused ganglia around the pharynx with a ventral nerve cord connecting down the body of the worm. Polyschaetes tend to be dioecious with seasonal or temporary gonads, while oligoschaetes, which include the earthworms and leeches, are monoecious with permanent gonads. Polyschaete fertilization is external with a trochophore larva stage, while oligoschaete fertilization is internal and typically cross-fertilizing with two separate individuals depositing sperm in each other's ovaries. The clitellum serves as a site of reproduction and is eventually shed as a cocoon where young worms hatch and appear like adults. All annelids can also asexually reproduce by budding and fragmentation, especially the polyschaetes. It is a myth that splitting an earthworm in two will result in two worms. The back half lacks any vital organs, but the front half can regenerate. Half of annelids are marine polyschaetes, which are named for having parapodia with bristle-tipped setae and can be split into two groups. First are the modal polyschaetes, which use their parapodia to move along the ocean floor or use them to swim or float. Tube worms are polyschaetes that use the parapodia for filter feeding and are sessile. Most have calcium carbonate shells to hide in. Some tube worms even live near deep-sea hydrothermal vents where they have symbiotic relationships with bacteria in their bodies that make food. Earthworms are the more common member of this class, having reduced setae on the ventral surface to allow it to anchor to surfaces, and they also have a permanent clitellum. Leeches have seasonal clitellum and are predatory, feeding off of blood and bodily fluids of their prey. Leeches do not have internal segmentation like earthworms, which allows their bodies to fill and expand with blood. Hirudo medicinalis, also known as the medicinal leech, has been used for millennia for bloodletting, which is not advised. Now, medicinal leeches are being researched for their anticoagulant properties in their saliva, which may help people with blood clotting disorders and other cardiovascular diseases. In our next video, we're going to be looking at nematodes and tardigrades.